Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, President and CEO of the New York Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Curator Confidential, a live virtual program presented exclusively for members and other supporters of our museum. I hope you're all healthy and safe as you watch this program from home this evening. And I want to say that we so look forward to welcoming you back to New York Historical in the very near future. Also want to say thank you to all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your great generosity. We can only continue to make history matter with your ongoing support. I am ready to introduce my colleague, Rebecca Klassen. Rebecca is the Associate Curator of Material Culture at New York Historical. She works on our History Response Initiative, which is an important collecting program which we launched in 2001 in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. We collect objects, photographs, and ephemera from the present day for use as research sources and also in future exhibitions. In essence, preserving history as is happening. I'm delighted to turn the program over now to Rebecca.
I'm Rebecca Klassen, and before I launch our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function in your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, I will get to as many questions as time allows. As background to today's discussion about our collecting around the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, I thought I would start with a look at earlier projects. Indeed, collecting related to current and recent events is really part of the New York Historical Society's DNA, from its founders who in 1804 sought to capture the history of the Revolutionary War before it faded from memory, to the launch of the History Response Collecting Initiative immediately after September 11th. Some of you may be familiar with this case in our fourth floor galleries, which touches on our collecting during that latter period. Along with a community shrine that appeared on Barclay Street, 2 blocks from the World Trade Center site, the case features a Venetian blind retrieved from St. Paul's churchyard. Here you can see in the Venetian blind in slightly better detail, as well as an image of the churchyard taken by the photographer Edward Keating, close to the way it would have appeared when Kenneth T. Jackson, then president of New York Historical, spotted the blind in a tree and retrieved it. This quotidian functional object is mangled and completely wrested from its original context, which broadly suggests the dissociation that occurs with a radically violent event such as 9/11. It was Ken Jackson who charged curators and other staff to go out to the field and gather the evidence of history as it was unfolding, and which led to the formation of a massive collection of related materials. Objects also tell the story of individuals who responded to the tragedy, whether in an official capacity or as volunteers who were moved to act by the urgency of the moment. On the left, we see ID badges for Ronald R. Moser and Canine companion Leica Moser. Ronald was a police officer based in Louisville, Kentucky, whose help was sought by the New York Police Department. He brought 2 bomb-sniffing dogs, Ajax and Leica, who searched for potential explosives in vehicles and supplies, as well as in ferries that transported visitors to Ground Zero. The ID badges are currently on loan to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum for their exhibition Canine Courage, which honors the hundreds of dogs that were put into service at the 9/11 attack sites. On the right is a Starbucks apron worn by Nancy Kane, a store manager from Texas, whose sister Meg Lee traveled with her church to volunteer in New York City. Nancy followed her, located coffee supplies at a local Starbucks, and wore this apron while serving beverages to relief workers who came through St. Paul's Chapel. In addition to tragedies and disasters, another area that we have frequently addressed in our responsive collecting efforts over the decades is protests and social unrest. On the left, a sign protesting the Iraq War was collected from the street on March 22nd, 2003. Was found discarded on 6th Avenue and 11th Street following a large march from Times Square to Washington Square Park. The invasion of Iraq began on March 19th, setting off a couple of weeks of intense protests across the country and around the world. On the right is a protest sign from the 2017 Women's March on Washington. The museum and library divisions undertook a major effort to collect artifacts from the women's marches that year, which at the time was considered the largest single-day protest in US history and saw solidarity marches across the globe. A selection of the items we collected were on view in a small exhibition that you may have seen called Collecting Women's Marches in 2018. And lest you think that we have only collected items during challenging moments in our collective past, I thought I would show you two items that are from joyous commemorations. Nothing quite says party like confetti, right? But the quality of the two handfuls of confetti speaks to the specific celebrations. And so they have value as physical evidence for interpretation, despite being quite literally throwaway objects. On the right, so-called ticker tape, sorry, that's on the left. Ticker tape from the New York Yankees World Series Championship Parade in 2000, which celebrated a victory over the New York Mets. Ticker tape parades, of course, began in 1886 and referred to the paper from ticker tape machines that provided updates on the stock market. But that ticker tape was replaced by paper in the 1960s, shredded paper, and you can see newspaper that has been shredded in long, skinny strips. On the right is confetti from last June's World Pride March, which marked the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. The streets were thick with confetti tossed from floats, and all of it in rainbow, of course, and I grabbed a handful while marching with the New York Historical Society's contingent. When I joined New York Historical Society's curatorial staff as a research assistant in 2013, the deep legacy of the institution's responsive collecting was one that I was very much aware of, and it shone like a beacon. It wasn't until Pope Francis's world tour in 2015 that I felt I could take a baby step into the shoes of my professional forebears. So if you recall, in late September, Pope Francis visited New York City in a whirlwind of stops at various sites carried by his famed Pope-mobile. So in the late afternoon of his full day in town, I set out on what I like to call Pope chasing in order to see what commemorative items I could obtain along the route. Sadly, all I found was this commemorative pin. It's very small, but it set me on the path to examining how I could meaningfully contribute to and keep alive the generations of responsive work that has been done at New York Historical. And so we come to the present moment, which for all of its tragic contours differs substantially from 9/11 in that it is unfolding relatively slowly. As staff, we have been barred from our normal methods of operating as our building closed its doors on Friday, March 13th to the public and to most staff. It was also the day that various staff began to send out emails about collecting the moment. But how does one collect materials responsively and responsibly during a time of isolation, as well as deep concerns about the safety, the very safety of the physical world and the stuff that is in it? As a clear answer comes through, of course, with digital materials. Many with cameras, maybe even you, have felt compelled to visually document your experiences in this clearly historic time. In March and April, as COVID-19 admissions and deaths were on the rise, Dr. Paul D. Wright, who is the system chair of neuroscience at New Vance Health, took a series of digital photos of staff at Vassar Brothers Medical Center in Poughkeepsie. In his donation statement, he said, quote, "I witnessed incredible care, compassion, and camaraderie from the staff. I wanted to capture the human emotion through my photographs," end quote. As my colleague Marilyn Kushner, curator of photography, interprets this image, which shows a worker in front of sheets of paper taped to a wall. The hospitals were so overrun that they had to resort to makeshift methods to track all of their patients. While we don't see this worker's face, we can only imagine the intense responsibility she must have felt as she checks the status of the COVID patients under hospital care. Our library division has put great thought as well into collecting digital material, and a small team led by Nina Nazionale, Director of Library Operations and Curator of Printed Materials, has been saving digital flyers, notices, and other guidance issued by public agencies, revisiting sites on an ongoing basis to try to capture the frequently updated materials. Many of these were intended to be printed and posted in public settings. Just as a sampling, on the left is an informational poster issued in February by the Department of Health, a Russian translation of a design called Cover Your Cough. On the right is material released in April by the Center for Disease Control as part of their toolkit for persons experiencing homelessness. And it briefly addresses concerns that people may have around sharing resources and indoor spaces. On the museum division side, as the scope of our intentions grew and life under Stay at Home began to take shape, it became increasingly necessary to jot down the ways in which the pandemic was affecting culture and society, because it was pretty much a wholesale upheaval. In late March, I shared a document, or I started a shared document that I labeled Coronavirus Objects/Trends. And here you see my initial jots, which were all about how people were spending time indoors, and they were based on what was being reported in the news. So anything from playing a board game called Pandemic to baking bread and frantically buying chickens to embarking on complex jigsaw puzzles. These were national trends, but were still applicable to our geographic collecting parameters of New York State and the surrounding area. As the shared document grew, it became more about mapping out entire areas of society and culture to do outreach. We moved past this document sometime in May, but as you can see, it's really a broad outline with notes about items that might reflect the changes and adaptations we've witnessed during the pandemic. And as you can see, the major line of pursuit was trying to locate objects to illustrate these sectors, going from the macro to the micro, from the trend to the very specific instance. So while we've done a significant amount of outreach, we're also fortunate that some areas of our wish list are flowing toward us through donations, often in response to media coverage about our history response collecting efforts. So we knew we wanted to document the emergence of field hospitals in New York City, but one that was eluding us was the US Army Hospital at the Javits Center. So we were fortunate to be contacted by someone named Jonathan Estreich in response to a New York Times article that came out just last week. Jonathan is an investigator with the MTA Inspector General's office, and he was sent to Javits from April 1st to the 2nd to assist with the audit of donated PPE, or personal protective equipment. But he was concerned there was a newborn he had at home, and so he wanted a mask, and he requested one when he arrived. But he observed that he was one of only a couple of people who were wearing one at the time. And then when the hospital decided that it would admit COVID patients late in the day on April 2nd, he asked to be reassigned. The majority of donations so far has been as a result of outreach. Samaritan's Purse, a North Carolina-based evangelical Christian aid organization, partnered with Mount Sinai to open a field hospital in Central Park. The very existence of a hospital in Central Park seemed very noteworthy and worth collecting. So my colleague Christian Penite reached out to them. The 68-bed hospital opened on April 1st and discharged its last patients on May 7th, having treated more than 300 patients, 190 of which were at the Central Park location. So one of the objects we received was an N95 mask worn by nurse Shelley Kelly, a Tulsa, Oklahoma resident who has deployed once or twice a year since 2010 to disasters around the world. Staff write their names on their PPE so that patients and colleagues can identify them. And Shelley always includes a smiley face to give a dose of positivity. We also received this cowbell, which was rung by staff and discharged patients to celebrate their recovery during an exit walk from Samaritan's Purse Field Hospital. The clanging sound could be heard all throughout the tents, and staff would emerge to cheer them on. It was patterned after a tradition of ringing a bell when cancer patients receive their final treatment. However, the presence of Samaritan's Purse was highly controversial, and we felt we needed to document multiple viewpoints. The LGBTQ group Reclaim Pride Coalition, along with activists from ACT UP, organized a series of protests against their presence. The Evangelical Christian group, which was founded by Franklin Graham, requires that volunteers sign a statement of faith that holds that marriage is exclusively the union of one genetic male and one genetic female, among other religious beliefs. These tenets led the protesters and some city officials to question whether bias would lead to discriminatory care, and whether its presence really aligned with New York City's values. Reclaim Pride has donated this banner that says "Hate Won't Heal," used in its first protest on April 14th, and an example of an ACT UP face mask worn by the protesters, which you can see in this image, as well as a protest sign. We've also sought to document the efforts of everyday people contributing to what is often described as a war effort. A group of New York City doctors started Masks for Medicine in mid-March to collect donations of masks and other protective equipment and to distribute them to hospitals. Working out of a conference room at NYU Langone, it later expanded to supplying other frontline providers, essential workers, and at-risk communities. On June 26th, it announced that it was shutting down operations, and we've acquired a small sampling of the 100,000 plus masks that they distributed, as well as notes sent with the donations and various donation records and photos. What I find interesting about the sampling of face masks is the wide range in quality. So on the top is one that is very well executed, and one of the volunteers noted that it includes a wire at the nose, which was very advanced for late March. And on the bottom is very noble, but very improvisational effort. But both speak to the quest of home sewers to locate materials, sometimes merely in their own homes. By now, face masks are perhaps the emblem for responses to personal and collective health during the pandemic. We've been offered examples from people who have individually made hundreds of them, prompted out of a sense of duty. But perhaps what's very 21st century about face masks compared to other health crises is the extent to which they have been so individualized. It speaks to the creativity and resourcefulness and a desire to make a personal statement or even a political statement. One face mask that we received is from Chris Pearson, who is an artist who made his using a print from Scalamandre, that venerated New York City-based textile manufacturer, with underwire from his girlfriend's old bra, elastic from a mask he received attending a performance of Sleep No More, and a Swiffer pad. So through its very materials, it tells a distinctively New York story. He's improved on his design and technique, so he felt he could offer this one. And this face mask, which was sewn by a Baltimore resident, Jane Benson, for her nephew, George, is a reflection of both the maker and the recipient. So George is a museum professional who can sometimes be spotted giving his tours for MoMA on the intriguing prompt of what makes an artwork queer. The aunt and nephew share an appreciation for the films of John Waters, a Baltimore native, and the flamingo print is a reference to the film Pink Flamingos. So the mask is embroidered with, "If you can read this, you are too close, hun." But life during beyond the coronavirus goes on, and that includes other medical issues. So for a brief moment, New York City hospitals were barring partners during the delivery of babies. Despite Governor Cuomo issuing an order saying that that wouldn't happen, there were still incidents and leading expectant mothers to wonder if they would be giving birth without the support of loved ones. Mothers have the added worry of getting sick themselves and the potential transmission of COVID to their newborn child in a hospital setting. In the midst of these concerns, Brooklyn resident Hillary Clover gave birth to her daughter at Mount Sinai West on April 11th. In this photo, we see her holding her baby for the first time, and she's donated the blanket you see here, as well as the hospital wristbands, as a way to share in this experience. Cultural life goes on as well. So one of the bright spots of the quarantine, if there could be such a thing, is the way in which people came together virtually to release their stress through social media and Zoom. One of the figures who emerged from this is D Nice, a New York-born DJ and hip-hop artist who's been live streaming his DJ sets on Instagram. He started just for a group of his friends, but soon averaged up to 200,000 viewers at any given point during his sets. So everyday viewers rubbed elbows with celebrities in the comments, leading to the sense that you were sharing in an experience of enjoying the music at the same time. So the Obamas, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden dropped in, to be seen. But we were just as thrilled as his now millions of followers when he decided to release t-shirts that say, "I danced at Club Quarantine." For businesses, the experience of the pandemic has been all about the pivot, and many distilleries around the country pivoted to the production of hand sanitizer during national shortages. Kings County Distillery, which is located in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, donated a bottle of their hand sanitizer made from high-proof alcohol that would have otherwise gone toward whiskeys. And on the right, Iron Smoke Distillery, their whiskey making operation was shut down on March 16th, and they then pivoted to hand sanitizer. Following the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police on May 25th, on the heels of news about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and others, national attention shifted dramatically to the Black Lives Matter movement. Among the protest signs we have collected is one by Marcel Bert, who's born in Gabon. And his protest sign says, "Watching the news feels like being in the 1960s again," in response to seeing the onslaught of bad news on TV and the resulting feeling that nothing has changed. And on the right, Aisha Wilson made this protest sign on June 3rd to take to a memorial prayer service that she knew Floyd's younger brother would be in attendance. An anonymous artist who works under the moniker Artist for George paints a very large portrait of George Floyd every day to give to protesters, preferably to a young Black man. The composition stays the same, but the color treatments are always unique. And so throughout protests across the past month, you might see a handful of these unmistakable portraits held high above the heads of the marchers. During the first weekend of protests, looting broke out in various parts of New York City, including the shopping area of Soho. And retailers quickly boarded up their storefronts. And then in the weeks that followed, artists descended into the area to create murals on the plywood, giving rise to a new sense of the area as an open-air studio in a time of political and social urgency. From the mid-1960s to 1990s, of course, Soho was known for its art scene, but it has since become heavily commercial. And so with the murals, artists and longtime residents felt they were able to briefly reclaim Soho for artists. We acquired a mural that covered Taft, which is a men's shoe store depicting George Floyd, by the artists Matt Adamson and Joaquin G. And a second mural, which covered the window of Simone Rocha, a high-end women's clothing store, by the siblings Liam and Mia Lee, and it names Black people who have been killed by the police. It's patterned after, or the theme is after a Georgia O'Keeffe painting called Sky Above Clouds 4 that hangs at the Art Institute of Chicago. And the plane with a banner that says, "Please, I can't breathe," which is George Floyd's last words, is a reference to the work of Jamie Holmes, a Dallas-based artist whose sky banners with these and other phrases uttered by Floyd appeared in 5 US cities on May 30th. Sometimes there are happy accidents. So when we picked up the mural, we discovered elements of a work by, apologies. We discovered elements of the work of Lydia Venieri's Say Their Names project, which consists of portraits of those who have been killed by the police, along with QR codes that lead to petitions to reopen their cases. Some of the most significant materials from the Black Lives Matter protests come from Occupy City Hall. If you're probably familiar, if you live in New York, with the occupation, but the essential demand was that the New York City Council shift $1 billion from the New York City Police Department's $6 million budget to areas like education, housing, and social services when the budget would be approved on June 30th. The encampment has since transitioned, but when I visited from June 26th to July 2nd to observe the space, I collected flyers and pinback buttons and met people from various groups participating, and a long-term volunteer gathered a large trove of materials on our behalf, including protest signs, banners, and some of the directional and instructional signs that you see here. This banner, which is stenciled with the names of Black people who were killed by the police or lynched, is a yet untitled work in progress of an anonymous artist collective, which began collaborating at Occupy City Hall. On the right, we see it suspended from the Potter Building on Park Row in Nassau on May 30th, 2020, a photo sent to us by our trustee, Ernest Tollerson. This collective is actively searching for another building to hang it from, so please let me know if you know of any. And where do we go from here? I show these last two examples, digital items collected by the library, because it has become clear that while New York City has flattened the curve and we are now in phase 4 of reopening, the next year or two may be a national game of contraction and expansion. If there are any lessons to be learned from the pandemic, it is the importance of remaining nimble and flexible, and certainly our responsible collecting will follow the same trajectory. Yes, it is a tragedy. So as a last bit of information before I respond to any questions, I urge you to look at the History Response page on our website for further information and a submission form should you or someone you know wish to donate materials. So that's nyhistory.org/history-response. And then for any questions, we can be reached at historyresponse@nyhistory.org. And on the screen, you see some of the areas that we would still like to see represented. And so now I'll take some questions. So the first question, how do you imagine displaying some of these objects and images in future exhibits or online? It's always hard to predict the demand for the public to, on the part of the public to see these types of materials, but sometimes the need is great to reflect on what just happened. There's actually an exhibition opening in mid-August. It's in our back lot, and it will deal with issues of the pandemic, but it won't be items that we've collected. It's a really good question. It's hard to tell. Okay, next question. You mentioned DJ Nice, and so I wonder, how do you think social media has played a role in being able to do this kind of collecting work as opposed to more traditional collecting efforts? It has been critically important because up until the Black Lives Matter protests, I was really working from home, as we all were. And so tracking instances on social media and reaching out to people via social media has been really the central to my work. And life has really transpired over the internet while we have been at home. So the next question is, what kind of safety protocols and decontamination procedures are exercised when collecting and cataloging items related to events like 9/11 and COVID-19, for which exposure to unsafe material is a risk? Recent data has suggested that there is less risk of contracting COVID-19 through handling of materials. However, very early on, we instituted a protocol where items could be mailed to the museum and they would be basically quarantined and put in a spot by the few essential staff that remain. And that's basically what we still do. We let the objects rest before we really handle them, and of course, wash our hands as we would normally. So what factors do you use to determine which items are worth collecting? What makes for a compelling image or object that documents this moment? I would say that the factors really change over time. You know, so on the first weekend of protests, I headed out on my bicycle that Sunday morning and tried to find protest signs that were left behind. And the protesters these days are pretty good about not littering for the most part. And so they take their signs home with them. But I found in some recycling bins a sign that says, "I can't breathe," and another sign that says, "Black Lives Matter." So they're interesting because they were made during that first weekend. But as time has gone on, they're maybe fairly commonplace. So I think, you know, those types of materials we will reassess as time goes on. Another factor that leads us to collecting an item is the story behind it. And so when people send us submissions via email, we look closely at what motivated them to make it or buy it or whatever however they engage with those items, and how that might represent the important issues of the day. What are some of the ethical issues connected with this kind of collecting? Are there established principles? Certainly there are issues around medical information, and so medical organizations are always careful about divulging any sort of personal information about the identity of any of the patients or their diagnoses. And so we pay close attention to that. As far as the protests, an ongoing topic of intense debate is whether or not to show images of protesters. Of course, in this day and age, most are masked, the vast majority are masked, but there are some who are not, of course. And so, especially among Black activists, they're very concerned with future repercussions. And so that's something we have to be very careful about. And these images are only starting to flow toward us, and so we need to carefully consider how we might keep people safe. What is your favorite item you've collected through the History Response program and why? Well, the Pope pin that I shared with you earlier is just purely sentimental. So in that kind of initial foray into this kind of work, it's something that I hold close to my heart. Just off the top of my head, there's a protest costume that was created by a collective called Brick by Brick. And it's a jumpsuit with a brick patterned print on it, and includes some of the things that Trump has said about women on individual bricks. And it's basically a performance artwork, and the protesters array themselves in a sort of a wall formation and stand in silent protest. And just as an artifact, I just think it's really evocative and powerful. So how do you think these kinds of items correlate to and can be in discussion with other items in the broader historical society collection? Well, the reason why I shared some of the earlier items we've collected is to show that connection. So for instance, the ID badge that was issued to Mr. Moser and his dog Laika has a nice resonance with the ID badge that we've been offered or given by Jonathan Estreich, who was at Javits Center. And protest signs, of course. And sometimes they really show how issues continue. They don't quite resolve in the way that you wish they would, right? And so the 2017 Women's March sign directly discussed Black Lives Matter. And here we are a few years later, witnessing an upheaval in that direction as well. Are you collecting stories, parentheses, oral histories, as well as images and objects? So we aren't doing an oral history project per se, but when we collect objects, I do an interview in conjunction with it. So I think it's really important that, 2 years down the line, 20 years down the line, future researchers and curators don't make assumptions about who this person was and why they made it. And based on their biases about their sense of history. So let's see. What do you do? How do you decide which items to accession? Well, for street collected items, after we've kind of gone through maybe a simmering process, we decide we reflect upon what might be worth keeping, what might tell the story the best. And then as far as what do we do with items that aren't accepted? Well, we try to head off the bat, for donors who submit queries to us via email, we make a decision then and there to accept or not accept, because it's a large effort for an individual to undertake. They have to fill out the form, send an image, make time to get it picked up, submit to an interview. So, you know, we want to value their time. And as far as street collected things, that's a very good question. Let's see. Have there been any items you received multiples of from different donors? We basically accept the first instance, if that makes any sense. In the 2017 Women's Marches, there was a project called, let's see, it was called Miss. And it was a series of sashes that say, for instance, misrepresented or misunderstood, basically a riff on beauty pageants and Trump's connection to them, as well as the political process. And in that instance, because everyone, they were given out freely to protesters. And so we did collect multiples of those in different variations in order to basically collect the stories behind them. Okay, are there, oh, another question. When do you think an exhibition at NYHS about COVID will go up? Or when do you think exhibitions will start at other museums? Well, they are already starting. As I mentioned, there's an exhibition that will be opening at New York Historical Society in our backyard, our back lot. It's an open air space. It is called, I should know this off the top of my head. Well, anyway, forgive me. Thank you. It's called Hope Wanted. And it'll be essentially a tour, a photographic tour of the 5 boroughs in the early days of the pandemic, along with oral histories that you can listen to on your phone, and then a space to share stories. Okay, so I'm being told that my time is up. I hope you enjoyed the talk. So thank you so much for your participation and for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight with the next episode of Curator Confidential, Bill Graham and the History of Rock and Roll. Join Bonnie Simmons, Executive Director of the Bill Graham Memorial Foundation, Bob Barsati, the President of the Bill Graham Memorial Foundation, and Christian Panaite, Associate Curator of Exhibitions at New York Historical Society, as they discuss one of the most influential concert promoters of all time.